Hello everyone. My name is Sarah. At 42 years old, I've spent 2 decades embracing the beautiful, messy chaos of motherhood. I raised 3 children in a drafty, sprawling colonial in the heart of Ohio, where the soundtrack of my life was the slamming of screen doors and the rhythmic thumping of teenagers racing up the stairs. I was a woman who never feared a floorboard's creak. To me, those sounds were evidence of a house that was alive, breathing, and full of love. But when the last child left the nest, that big house began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a mausoleum of memories that required too much dusting. David and I decided it was time to trade the lawnmower for a morning latte on a balcony. We were looking for this simple life, luxury, security, and a community that didn't require a weekend of gutter cleaning. We found the Maples, an exclusive 18-unit complex draped in ivy and tucked against a nature preserve. It looked like an English manor plucked from the countryside and dropped into a quiet corner of the state. It was a legacy building, the kind of place where residents didn't just live. They stayed until the very end, forming a closed loop of history and hushed hallway conversations. We bought Unit 302 from Tim, the former HOA president, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes. During the final walkthrough, as the sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Tim seemed preoccupied with the floor. He didn't look at the crown molding or the granite countertops we were praising. His gaze was fixed on the hardwood directly above the unit below. He walked with a peculiar light-footed grace, almost as if he were trying to avoid waking a sleeping giant beneath the floorboards. As he handed over the keys, his hand brushed mine and I noticed he was trembling. He leaned in, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Sarah, David, just a word of advice. Barbara lives in 202 right below you. She's the heartbeat of this building. I found that if I just kept her happy, fixed her leaking faucets, changed her ballast, kept the noise to a zero, life was much easier. Think of it as a small price to pay for such a view. Just try not to exist too loudly." At the time I laughed, thinking he was just a gentlemanly neighbor. I didn't realize Tim was a man handing over his shackles. Beyond the warning about Barbara, Tim seemed desperate to leave, as if he were an inmate finally granted parole after a 20-year sentence. He spent an unusual amount of time showing us how to soft close every cabinet door, insisting that the echo in the building was deceptive. I watched him wipe a smudge off the wall with a frantic intensity, as if he were cleaning up a crime scene before the inspectors arrived. It was clear that his identity had been swallowed whole by the demands of the woman below. He wasn't just a homeowner, he was a servant who had forgotten what it felt like to walk with a heavy heel. As we watched his car pull out of the driveway for the last time, David joked that Tim was probably heading straight to a mountaintop to scream at the top of his lungs. We laughed, standing in our empty, gleaming kitchen, admiring the way the oak trees outside filtered the afternoon light into patterns on the floor. We made plans for dinner, talked about where to put the bookshelf, and toasted to our new beginning. We had no idea that within 48 hours, the very air in this beautiful room would feel too heavy to breathe without permission. We moved in on a humid Tuesday, surrounded by a mountain of cardboard and the smell of packing tape. By 4 p.m., the movers had left, and I was standing in the middle of our new living room, sweaty and exhausted, holding a lukewarm slice of pizza. I was finally feeling the peace we had paid for, that sense of a new chapter beginning. Then the doorbell rang. It wasn't a friendly ding-dong. It was a sustained 3-second buzz that felt like a summons from a high court, vibrating through the metal of the door and into my very bones. I opened the door to find Barbara standing there. She didn't look like the delicate soul Tim had described. She looked like a general about to inspect a barracks. She was 65, with silver hair pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to pull the corners of her eyes upward. She wore a crisp white linen blouse, not a single wrinkle to be found, and clutched a clipboard to her chest like a shield. She didn't wait for an invitation. She stepped past me into my foyer, her eyes immediately darting to the floor to scan for scuffs left by the moving crew. "Tim always left his shoes at the door," she said, skipping any pretense of a greeting. Her voice was thin and sharp like a paper cut. "And I've noticed a black mark on the elevator trim. I expect you'll have that buffed out by tomorrow morning. Oh, and my kitchen light is flickering." Tim usually handled the electrical ballasts for me on his way home from work. I stood there, pizza in hand, staring at this woman who had just assigned me chores within 3 hours of my arrival. I felt a cold prickle of realization that our sanctuary had come with a self-appointed warden. I tried to maintain my polite new neighbor persona, offering a firm smile. "It's lovely to meet you, Barbara. But David and I aren't handy people. Doctor's orders, David has a bad back and we stay off ladders. I can certainly give you the number of a professional handyman service, though." The air in the foyer didn't just turn cold, it vanished. Barbara's face turned a deep, bruised purple. She looked at me with a look of pure, unadulterated venom. "Tim was a leader," she hissed. You are just a disruption. And I don't tolerate disruptions." She turned on her heel and marched out, leaving my front door wide open. What struck me most wasn't just her entitlement, but the way she looked at our belongings, as if our very presence was dirt on her polished floor. She lingered for a moment on a photo of our children, her lip curling in a way that suggested she saw them as nothing more than future sources of noise. There was no welcome in her eyes, only a calculation of how much of our spirit she would need to break to maintain her absolute control over the building's atmosphere. She didn't want neighbors, she wanted a void that paid the mortgage above her. As the door clicked shut, a sound that felt dangerously loud in the wake of her exit, David and I shared a look of pure disbelief. The excitement of the move evaporated, replaced by a heavy, sinking dread that sat in the pits of our stomachs. We realized that Tim hadn't just been nice. He had been terrified into a life of servitude. Barbara hadn't just come to meet us, she had come to mark her territory and establish the hierarchy, and we had just committed the ultimate sin of refusing to be her domestic help. The first formal complaint hit my inbox the very next morning at 6:02 a.m. It was an email from the HOA management portal, flagged as urgent. Barbara claimed that our industrial machinery had kept her awake all night with vibrations that rattled her bedside table. The truth was far more mundane. We had spent the night in a state of exhaustion, and the only thing running was a small, battery-operated white noise machine that whispered the sound of rain. It was the first shot in a war I didn't yet know I was fighting. Within a month, the psychological erosion was complete. I was no longer the confident woman who managed 50 employees. I was a ghost in my own home. I spent $1,500 on thick high-pile rubber mats to put under every single appliance from the refrigerator to the toaster. I covered our beautiful hardwood floors with rugs so thick they felt like moss. I stopped wearing slippers or shoes entirely. I spent my days in thick wool socks, gliding across the floor like a ninja, terrified that a single heel strike would trigger the wrath from below. The interaction with David changed too. We stopped talking in the kitchen. We began to point and whisper, our conversations reduced to hushed tones in the center of the bed, away from the vents. I found myself standing in the kitchen holding a ceramic mug with a shaking hand, calculating the decibel level of setting it down on the granite. Every normal act of living felt like a crime. I was a 42-year-old executive, and I was crying in my living room because I was afraid to flush the toilet at 2 a.m. for fear of the pipe noise she hated. Thump, thump, thump. The sound of her broom handle against our floorboards became the heartbeat of our house. It was a rhythmic reminder that she was always there, sitting in the dark, head tilted back, staring at her ceiling and listening to us exist. Drop a spoon? Thump. Laugh at a joke? Thump. The most terrifying sound, however, was the ice dispenser. The clack 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 of the cubes hitting the glass felt like machine gun fire in the oppressive silence she demanded. I started drinking lukewarm water just to avoid the sound. I began to notice the subtle ways she was tracking us through the building's infrastructure. If I ran the water in the sink for more than 30 seconds, I would hear her vent rattle, a sign she was standing in her bathroom listening. If David and I sat on the balcony to watch the sunset, we would see her reflection in the glass of the unit across the nature preserve, her binoculars aimed squarely at our deck. It wasn't just about noise anymore. It was about the total loss of privacy, the feeling that our home had become a stage where we were forced to perform a play titled, The Silent Tenants. The physical toll was becoming visible. I had dark circles under my eyes from lack of sleep, not because of noise, but because of the hypervigilance required to remain silent. My shoulders were permanently hunched, my muscles locked in a state of perpetual tension, waiting for the next strike from the floorboards. David, usually the optimist, had become sullen and withdrawn, spending hours staring at the floor with a look of defeated resentment. We were paying for a luxury condo, but we were living in a high-priced isolation chamber, and our sanity was beginning to fray at the edges. The tension reached a boiling point when the HOA board called a safety and harmony meeting in the common room. Barbara arrived with a blue 3-inch thick binder that she slammed onto the table with the theatrical flair of a prosecutor. She called it the nuisance log. It was a terrifyingly detailed record of our private lives, a testament to her obsession. She had timed our showers, logged our laundry cycles, and recorded the exact moment our front door opened and closed for 30 consecutive days. She began to read my life aloud to the board, her voice trembling with fake practice tears. Tuesday, 10:14 p.m. Sarah took a bath. The sound of water rushing through the pipes is an auditory assault. She stayed in the tub for 22 minutes. The weight of the water in that tub is compromising the structural integrity of my ceiling. She had photos of my balcony. She had recorded the voices of our guests. She was sitting in the dark beneath us with a stopwatch and a pen, turning the sanctuary of our home into a goldfish bowl for her own entertainment. I looked at the board members, 3 men in their 70s who had been Tim's friends for decades. They wouldn't meet my eye. They were terrified of her. They had spent 20 years enabling her because it was easier than facing her. "Sarah," the board president said, his voice weak and pleading, "can't you just shower earlier? And maybe use ice trays instead of the dispenser? We just want peace at the Maples." They weren't asking for justice. They were asking for my total surrender to her delusions. In that moment, a cold, hard diamond of rage formed in my chest, replacing the fear. I realized that the harmony they wanted was just my silence. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor, a sound I knew Barbara would log, and I looked her dead in the eye. "No," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a blade. "I will not live in a home where my bathroom habits are logged by a voyeur. If this board processes one more frivolous complaint, I am filing a lawsuit for breach of quiet enjoyment and unwarranted harassment. And I won't just sue Barbara. I'll sue every one of you personally for enabling her." The board members looked at each other, the color draining from their faces as the word lawsuit echoed in the small room. They had spent years hiding behind Barbara's sensitivity, but now they were facing a legal reality they weren't prepared for. I could see the gears turning in their heads. The cost of defending a harassment suit would far outweigh the inconvenience of finally telling Barbara no. For the first time, the power dynamic in the room shifted, and the silence that followed was no longer dictated by Barbara, but by the weight of my threat. Barbara, sensing her grip on the board was slipping, let out a sharp, indignant gasp, her hands trembling as she clutched her binder. "This is a building of heritage," she shrieked, her voice cracking with the effort of maintaining her victimhood. But the board president just held up a hand, silencing her for the first time in 20 years. He looked at me with a newfound, albeit reluctant, respect. The mediation ended without a resolution, but as I walked out, I knew that the legacy of the Maples was about to meet the modern reality of legal accountability. I went home that night and I didn't hide. I didn't whisper. I walked into my office, sat down, and pulled out the 180-page HOA master deed and bylaws. I spent the next 6 hours hunched over those documents with a highlighter and a pot of coffee. If Barbara wanted to use the rules as a weapon, she was about to find out that I was a professional auditor. I dismantled her legal standing line by line, looking for the specific parameters that defined quiet enjoyment in the state of Ohio. I found my nuclear option on page 84. Section 9.04, Quiet Hours. The rules stated that 9 p.m. to 9 a.m. were strictly protected for silence. But the language for the other 12 hours was a gold mine. It explicitly stated that residents were permitted reasonable use of their units for standard household activities, including laundry, cleaning, and child's play. Barbara had spent years convincing everyone that reasonable meant silent. I was about to prove that reasonable meant active. I called my daughter Megan that night. "Meg, I need a favor. You know how you're always complaining about the laundromat near your apartment? I want you to bring it all here. Every towel, every pair of jeans, every rug. And I want you to bring Leo." Megan was confused, reminding me that I usually preferred a quiet house. I told her, "Leo isn't a disruption, honey. He's a percussionist. And he has a very important concert scheduled for Monday morning at 9:01 a.m. I went to the hardware store the next day and bought a set of heavy-duty stainless steel mixing bowls and metal ladles. I bought a pair of industrial-grade steel-toed work boots that were 3 sizes too big, specifically so they would create a deeper thud when they hit the floorboards. I wasn't just Sarah the victim anymore. I was the architect of karma. I lay in bed that Sunday night, listening to the silence of the building, knowing it was the last night Barbara would ever feel like the Queen of the Maples. I also spent time researching local noise ordinances and civil harassment statutes, building a secondary file that would make Barbara's nuisance log look like a child's diary. I realized that by logging our every move, she had inadvertently provided me with documented proof of stalking. Every entry she made was another piece of evidence I could use to show a pattern of obsessive surveillance. I wasn't just preparing for a neighborhood squabble. I was preparing to dismantle her entire lifestyle through the very channels she worshipped. The final piece of my plan involved a conversation with our attorney, who confirmed that reasonable use was a broad shield in Ohio law. He laughed when I described my plan, telling me that as long as I stayed within the daytime hours, I was legally untouchable. I felt a surge of adrenaline that I hadn't felt since my corporate days. This was a hostile takeover of my own life, and for the first time in months, I slept through the night, dreaming of the rhythmic clanging of stainless steel. Monday morning arrived with a crisp, cold clarity. I stood in my laundry room, my hand on the dial of our high-efficiency washer. I had loaded it with Megan's heaviest denim jeans and 3 pairs of David's old work boots. I checked my watch. 8:59, 9 o'clock. At exactly 9:01 a.m., I turned the dial to heavy-duty/extra spin, and pushed start. Clack. Thud. Clack. Thud. The vibration was magnificent. It was the sound of 6 months of suppressed rage being released into the air. I walked into the kitchen where 3-year-old Leo was waiting, eyeing the stainless steel pots I had laid out directly over Barbara's master bedroom. I handed him the metal ladles and whispered, "Make Grandma proud, Leo. Show me how big the music can be." He didn't need to be told twice. The explosion of rhythmic metallic banging filled the unit, echoing through the vents and down into the sanctuary below. I put on my oversized steel-toed boots and began to march from the kitchen to the living room, each step sounding like a mallet hitting a drum. The broom thumps from below started within 60 seconds. They weren't the rhythmic, confident taps of a warden anymore. They were frantic, desperate, and erratic. It was the sound of a trapped animal realizing the bars of the cage had moved. My phone rang almost immediately. It was Bill, the HA manager, his voice crackling with panic. "Sarah, Barbara says there's a riot in your kitchen. She says the chandeliers are literally swinging." I laughed, a sound that felt like medicine. "Oh, hi, Bill," I said cheerily, the sound of Leo's drum solo in the background. "No riot. Just catching up on some heavy-duty laundry and supervised play." It's 10 a.m. Bill. Per Section 9.04, these are standard household activities. If Barbara is bothered by the sound of a family living during legal hours, maybe she's the one who isn't suited for communal living? Tell her if she hits my floor again, I'm filing a police report for harassment. We did this for 14 days straight. We lived loudly, we laughed, and we reclaimed every decibel of our lives. The transformation in our unit was incredible. Instead of whispering, we were playing music at a reasonable but audible volume. Instead of gliding in socks, we were living in our shoes. The dark, heavy rugs were rolled up and stored in the basement, exposing the beautiful hardwoods that Barbara had tried to banish. We were no longer guests in her building. We were owners of our space, and every time the washing machine hit its spin cycle, it felt like a victory lap for our sanity. The most satisfying part was seeing the other neighbors start to follow suit. Elena from 304 stopped by with a tray of cookies, her eyes wide as she heard the symphony in the background. She told me she had finally gathered the courage to vacuum her living room at noon. A wave of normal life was washing over the Maples, and Barbara's empire of silence was being dismantled by the simple sound of people existing. She had tried to drown us in her rules, so we decided to teach the whole building how to swim in the noise. On the 15th day of our Symphony of Justice, something changed. The air in the building felt different, lighter, as if a vacuum seal had been broken. At exactly 10 a.m. I paused. I stood in the center of my kitchen and waited. I looked at the floorboards, expecting the frantic, desperate pounding of the broom handle. But there was nothing. No thumps. No muffled shrieks from the vents. Just the rhythmic hum of my dryer and the distant, melodic sound of birds chirping in the nature preserve. I walked to my balcony and looked down. Below me, a white SUV was idling in the driveway. Two men in professional uniforms were carrying out a heavy mahogany sideboard, the kind of furniture that looked like it had been anchored in one spot for 20 years. A for sale sign sat on the manicured lawn, its post still damp from being hammered into the earth. She was leaving. I saw Barbara one last time. She was standing by her trunk, clutching that blue binder, her nuisance log, to her chest like a fallen soldier holding a tattered flag. She looked smaller. The rigid, military posture was gone, replaced by a slight, defeated slump of the shoulders. The Queen of the Maples had been dethroned not by malice, but by the very rules she had used to imprison everyone else. She looked up and caught my eye. For a second I expected a final burst of rage, a parting threat. But there was nothing left. She looked at me with a mix of confusion and exhaustion, as if she couldn't comprehend a world where she didn't get to decide how long a neighbor's shower lasted. She got into her car, closed the door, gently, ironically enough, and drove away without looking back. I still keep a copy of those HOA bylaws on my shelf. They aren't tucked away in a junk drawer. They sit right there next to my cookbooks. I don't keep them as a weapon, but as a profound reminder of what it takes to protect your peace. You see, the final lesson I learned wasn't about how to make noise. It was about the difference between privacy and secrecy. Barbara wanted to turn our private lives into her secret obsession. She wanted to weaponize the normal sounds of human existence. A laugh, a footstep, a falling spoon, and turn them into crimes. She wanted us to be invisible so she could feel invincible. I realized that bullies like Barbara don't actually want silence. They want compliance. They want to feel the weight of their own power by watching you shrink. The moment I stopped shrinking, the moment I decided that my right to exist was non-negotiable, her power evaporated. It turns out that a bully's authority is only as strong as your willingness to be afraid. I also learned that community isn't about the absence of noise. It's about the presence of grace. A real community is a place where you hear a dog bark and you think, I'm glad they have a companion. It's a place where you hear a baby cry and you think, I hope those parents are doing okay. True peace isn't found in a silent room. It's found in a room where you are allowed to be human. We didn't break the rules to win. We simply forced the rules to be honest. We traded the quiet of the grave for the noise of the living, and I wouldn't trade it back for anything in the world. If this journey from being a prisoner in my own home to reclaiming my sanctuary gave you that sweet, lingering feeling of satisfaction, then do me a huge favor. Smash that like button right now. Every single like tells the algorithm that stories of justice and standing up to bullies deserve to be heard. It helps us reach more people who might be sitting in a quiet room right now, afraid to move, and shows them that there is a way out. But our journey doesn't have to end here. This channel is more than just my story. It's a gathering place for everyone who has ever had to deal with a Barbara, a Karen, or an HOA that forgot who they were supposed to serve. We are building a community of people who value their peace and aren't afraid to fight for it. So if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Join the family. When you subscribe and ring that notification bell, you're ensuring that you never miss our daily deep dives into the most satisfying, bone-chilling, and heartwarming stories of karma and neighborhood justice on the internet. We have a massive library of stories coming up. Everything from entitled landlords getting their comeuppance to workplace bullies meeting their match in the most creative ways possible. Now I want to hear from you. The comments section is where the real magic happens. I want you to vent. I want you to share. Have you ever had a neighbor who tried to track your every move? Have you ever had to use a creative loophole to get a bully off your back? Or maybe you're currently dealing with a situation and you need some advice from the community. Drop your story below. I read every single one of them, and many of our best videos start as a comment from one of you. Let's turn this comment section into a wall of justice. Tell me, what was your drum solo moment? And before you head off to your next video, check out the links in the description for more playlists of satisfying revenge stories. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. Remember, your home is your castle and you are the only one who gets to hold the keys. Don't let anyone, neighbor, HOA, or otherwise, ever make you feel like a ghost in your own life. Keep your head high, keep your spirit loud, and I'll see you in the very next story.